Shalom, welcome to our monthly edition of TV7's Power and Play. In today's edition, we're going to discuss a whole variety of issues, but after Venezuela and before Iran, President Trump's America First agenda was based on reaction to the military involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq and opposition to the nations of regime change and nation building. There was, however, one exception. The Western Hemisphere, the United States' backyard, from Canada to Latin America, now that Trump has proven in Venezuela that he seriously means what he says, the reaction from Tehran to Moscow and Beijing could be either concern that such an operation could also be carried out elsewhere, or that this is indeed an exception, and therefore other regimes have in essence immunity from American military power. Which of the two is more likely? Israel's strategic challenges related to this issue are also to be discussed today. But before all that, let's introduce our guests for today. Our regulars, of course, Dr. Colonel Eran Lerman, formerly Israel's Deputy National Security Advisor, Senior Officer at the IDF Intelligence Directorate, and a whole list of other positions over the years. Brigadier General in Reserve, Dr. Amnon Sofrin, formerly the Chief of Intelligence of Mossad, as well as a Senior Officer also at the IDF Intelligence Directorate, and our diplomat, Ambassador Danya Ayalon, formerly the Deputy Foreign Minister of the State of Israel, as well as Israel's Ambassador to Washington, and a whole long list of other positions which we'll have to compartmentalize for the next time, but last but certainly not least, TV7's editor-at-large, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, we are today in a position where we know America's national or strategic policy outlook for this year and moving forward. The Monroe Doctrine obviously is spearheading that, but nonetheless, when we look at broader terms, there are ripple effects to what we saw happening in Venezuela, the extraction of Maduro. One can only be impressed by the military operation, the manner in which they conducted the operational aspect of things. Now they need to consider the tactical achievements and translate that into a strategic victory. Long way off, but what are the implications for our region? Israel in particular, and the Islamic Republic of Iran has already held meetings about whether or not Trump is going to follow through on his threats with regard to the current uprising happening in that country.
So, Jonathan, we are making our living analyzing, assessing, forecasting events. And when we look at what candidate Trump, former President Trump, and future President Trump said over the years, we are flabbergasted because half of what he said came true during the first year of his second term, but the other half is somewhat contradictory. The America First, no forever wars, we shouldn't meddle in other people's businesses outside of the Western Hemisphere. So how can we project what has happened in Venezuela vis-a-vis Iran? Now, of course, in Iran, they are mindful of the Mossadegh precedent 70 years ago, when the Americans and the British helped the Shah, who was very weak, and elements in the armed forces topple a democratically elected prime minister, and helping the oil interests of the West, similar to Venezuela. But we also have other precedents. Hungary in 1956. The rebels, the counter-revolutionaries, believed American propaganda regarding coming to the rescue of oppressed people under the Soviet yoke. They rebelled, they revolted against the Soviets and were crushed. Now, we also have
This is one case. There was also the Velvet Uprising and others that were successful and did get the backing also from the United States.
What backing? Not military backing.
Not military, but
and
rhetoric was
yes,
ample.
yeah, rhetoric was ample. That's very true. We also have Trump's own words a year ago regarding the Riviera in Gaza. So before we get into Gaza specifically, so right now it's too hazardous to predict whether, if the Iranians do not knuckle under and if they do not accept Trump's warnings as a diktat, whether he will then go ahead. And of course, we are also mindful of his pleas for diplomacy. He has been very militant against Iran, including in the June war, but he has also asked the Iranians to negotiate. Perhaps it will be decided in the internal struggle within the ranks of the Iranian elite.
I will mention that the British Times has published a report about contingency plans being formulated by the Ayatollah regime currently for the Islamic Republic Supreme Leader to flee to Moscow in the event that things go sour. There are other reports on the complexities related to President Trump's statements that Abbas Araghchi, who spoke in a closed meeting with officers of the regime and others, he said, we are keen on negotiations, but I'm not the one who rules whether or not this is going to happen, namely referring to Ayatollah Khamenei. There is a rift within the terror establishment of the Islamic Republic, and they cannot necessarily fulfill their aspirations of deconfliction with the United States in the event that President Trump's overtures, as Mr. Oren just mentioned, towards a diplomatic resolution are rejected time and again. The same happened with Maduro, General Sofrin. I'd like to get your sense of this, because when we're looking at the relationship between Iran and Venezuela, it was a very close relationship. The Iranian proxy Hezbollah had a base of operation. It was pretty much a hot water bed, as the Americans refer to it, for various operations in the Western Hemisphere, in South America, in the world of criminal activities from cartels to illicit materials being also sent to Africa and elsewhere. What is this going then to impact to the degree that we can predict at this point, in light of the complexities that all those relations will be severed very promptly?
I think that if you look at Venezuela doesn't have not only relations with Iran, but also with China, because they sold a lot of oil to China, and with the low prices. And China is now damaged because of that, due to the fact that it is controlled by the Americans, and the Americans won't allow to sell that quantities to the Chinese, and Chinese have to find now new paths for energy. Second, it's what we call a signal to other countries as well, namely Colombia. Because Colombia is neighboring Venezuela, they're rivals, or used to be rivals until 2 days ago. And he sent a message to president of Colombia, telling him that beware, because you can suffer the same, you can face the same destiny, just like Maduro. Now, looking at how does it impact Iran and what are the implications on Iran, I don't think the Iranians are terrified from the idea that the Americans will try forcefully to change the regime. Even though President Trump declared that if you are going to keep on shooting your residents, I'm going to interfere and we're going to assist them, it's a declaration. I'm not sure that this is really going to happen, because it's not in the main interest. But I think that we should look at what we call a broader implications, and I mean China and Taiwan on one hand, and Russia and the Baltic countries on the second hand. That means that if President Trump allowed himself to get into Venezuela, to kidnap President Maduro and his wife, to take them out of Venezuela and to bring them for trial in the U.S. Now, if the Chinese decide tomorrow morning to invade Taiwan, what moral cause does he have, or moral excuse does he have to tell the Chinese that you are interfering in some other countries' internal interests?
Well, the special operators that extracted both Maduro and his wife were holding patches of DEA, namely their drug enforcement, which provides some legal grounds for those operations.
You can wear all kind of uniform. It doesn't really matter. We know who was beyond that. It's Delta Force, because they are the ones
Allegedly.
they are the ones who are capable of doing such operations or carry out such operations. But this gives now a green light, as I said before, to the Chinese to threaten more forcefully on invading Taiwan. That means that Russia is not going to apply to any proposal to stop the fighting in Ukraine without holding all the territories that they occupied, and to be able to launch from their attacks into the Baltic countries, namely Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia.
We're, of course, also taking into account what President Trump noted after the raid. He mentioned that the Mexican president, she's a very nice lady, but she's not actually the president. The one controlling the country are the cartels. If we're looking at Cuba, which is heavily reliant on Venezuelan oil, is, of course, now with the back against its wall. And there are a lot of ripple effects. But Ambassador Ayalon, I'd like to hear your take on this once more, because what General Sofrin is mentioning is something that has been thought about in the United States, the complexities of causality. What may happen right now or in the near future is something that every government needs to take into account. What are the risk assessments in this context? And of course, the Chinese are looking at this. This is a very robust message that the United States is willing to establish a certain narrative or control the narrative, saying this is what happens, and actually go and do that.
Yes, Jonathan, thank you. I want to be very specific with a pinpoint idea of what the operation means and why it took place now. And rightly so, it was suggested here, it was China. It's not vis-a-vis Venezuela, not even the Monroe Doctrine, it's China. We have to remember that China holds a leverage over the United States, the rare earth minerals. And this is something which is very, very strategic, worried the United States immensely.
Controlling roughly 80% of global rare materials.
And that could actually dictate, the race to the quantum computing, AI, and everything that really holds the future strategic priorities and advantages. So here, it seems like in order to counter that leverage over the rare earth material, the only thing the U.S. can do is withhold the supply of oil to China, and do it now, not to wait 5-10 years when it would be too late, but to do it now. And now Trump holds the leverage. I mean, he can stop all supply to China from Venezuela, which is the major source, Iran lesser so, Russia lesser so. So now there is a balance of threats between the US and China, where a trade-off can be rare earth material for oil. I think this is pretty much the gist of everything that has happened. And Trump seems to be quite strategic. And I would say there is, after so long, I think that we can find a pattern in his action. It's not that he is consistent, but we should not look for consistency, because what he does is actually throws screen smokes all over, so he can concentrate on what he thinks is right. So it's not, you don't have to look at what he said he would do, but what he really does. And these are two things that have no connection whatsoever.
I will point out, though, which when we're talking about China proper, it's not self-sustainable. It is a country reliant on third countries. It is actually suffering from acute deficiency in food products, which is something that every country needs to maintain. Unfortunately, some countries are trying to root it out within their own boundaries these days, but that is for another discussion. And when it comes to the rare earth materials or minerals, these also are extracted primarily from West Asia, Central Asia, from Africa, predominantly. So those things can be severed over time, and therefore it is a strategic power competition that is going to intensify over time. And this may also serve as a deterrent to Chinese efforts to consolidate the one China policy also vis-a-vis Taiwan, despite assessments indicating now between mid-27 to end of 27 to see some sort of development on that file. But Colonel Lehrman or Dr. Lehrman, I'd like to hear your take on the implications for our region. Let's bring it down to our region.
Let's first of all put this in context. The Venezuela, Trump has called it the Monroe Doctrine, Donald's corollary. By the way, he completely ignores President Teddy Roosevelt, who had a corollary very similar to what is being enforced now, which says every corrupt or failed regime in the Western Hemisphere could be subject to an American intervention. Back then, when Monroe made the doctrine, it was the British who enforced it, not him. But now it's America, and it's in full force. And you have to look at the NSSD to see that Latin America is first and foremost in the list of priorities. This is because Trump essentially was elected on the anti-migration ticket. That is also what he's trying to impose on Europe, a civilizationally self-defending Europe is his image. In other words, and put an end to migration. In America, of course, there are millions, tens of millions of Latin American migrants, many of them illegal. And Venezuela is the source of about 8 million people left Venezuela under the socialist rule. So that's one aspect of it, which is specifically and locally part of his grand political strategy. However, Venezuela, as we've been pointing out, has also been a kind of adjunct to the CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, which it's too late to stop North Korea on the nuclear issue. Of course, China and Russia are major challenges. But if you start taking out the weaker links in this potential coalition of adversarial forces, then Iran comes next. And again, the NSSD is very clear about preventing the Middle East from coming under the dominance of an adversarial power. And there's only one adversarial power in the region in Trump's worldview, namely Iran. So his language during the press opportunity with Prime Minister Netanyahu at Mar-a-Lago on the nuclear issue, on the ballistic missile issue, and now his statement about interfering in support of the demonstrators or rebels, if that will be what they turn out to be. I think if I was, sitting there in Khamenei's inner councils, I would be quite worried. On the other hand, one decision he may take, and we need to be very wary of that, is to accelerate the ballistic missiles and even the nuclear project in order to place himself where Kim Jong-un is now, a fat young fool who runs North Korea, but he has the bomb and he's invulnerable. Look at Maduro. You could not have done this to Maduro if Venezuela had nukes, right? So we may see actually, we're coming to a T.
It's a dilemma because this
Iran could try to mollify the Americans or try to challenge them. And if it makes the second choice, things could go much further very fast.
The prevailing assessment right now, also by the good ISIS, so to speak, by Mr. David and others, they're all discussing a more pacifist type of approach by the Iranians, waiting for latter opportunities, post-Trump opportunities to break out to nuclear proliferation. We'll have to wait and see, of course. The Iranians have their own rationale with regard to the complexities on the Western Bloc, because the East is trying also to establish rifts between Europe and the United States. You spoke about the complexities there. It does bring an article that Dr. Rafael Barrahi just published on Voz with regard to the breakaway between Rome and Byzantium of the time, 1054. A very interesting analogy between the two. Unfortunately, the Byzantium today is Muslim. So we do need to raise that this is a complex...
Since you mentioned the British, I would recommend also reading in the Jerusalem Institute of Strategy and Security, however, was a very interesting piece by Davidi on Iranian influence operations all over the world, aimed, among others, at the British. However, they are playing against the masters. The British are now the fountainhead of the information about internal rifts in Iran, some of it verified, some of it magnified, some of it designed to have the effect of bringing such rifts about. It's worth watching. They are the grandmasters of psyops in this respect.
They are quite capable indeed. Well, Mr. Oren, let's zoom in. What can we look today at our region and say beyond the Iranian question? Turkey is obviously playing a significant role. Egypt are trying to maneuver quite heftily. Just a couple of days ago, we had a phone conversation between President Erdogan and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, seeking to deepen their collaboration, and having that statement also expedite a certain rift between the Emiratis and the Saudis, set the stage for us.
So obviously everyone is looking at Washington, at the sole fount of power. There are no more checks and balances. We all grew up studying the American system of government. This is obsolete. Maybe it will come back. But right now, at least until the midterm elections, there is no legislative branch, there is no judiciary, there is only the executive, and within the executive, there is Trump. Now, whatever happened to his quest for the Nobel Peace Prize? If he is undertaking these military operations. And the answer is that for Trump, peace has always been coupled with prosperity. It has always been economics, finance, investments, trade. And therefore, if we go back to Iran and to the other countries in the region, wherever there are opportunities, and this is what he says to Iran, it's your choice. We can make Iran great again. You will have prosperity. You can sell your oil. Your citizens will prosper. This is what the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Jordanians are poor. We are not as poor as the Jordanians are. We are not as poor as the Syrians are.
But territorially vital for many of the projects.
Yes, but again, Trump has been a landlord in Manhattan. He had security guards, but the core business, was not security. And you know, the US Secret Service and then later the FBI came out of the Pinkerton private detective service, hired by the railroads to protect their businesses. So look at the dollar sign, which is probably going to be changed to a Trump sign sometime soon. Perhaps the United States of America will change its name too. And if the Iranians are shrewd enough, and the people in the bazaar are supposed to be shrewd, they will look at the business side of strategy, and we will all live happily ever after.
So I do think that the checks and balances in the United States are still in place. They did centralize much of the powers into the executive branch. I agree. Some may say a little bit too much in that direction, but with that being said, everything is reversible and everything is ultimately within the confinement of what a president may do. He can designate the powers that a national security advisor can have, or the Secretary of State, or even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs can become a puppet or an actual policy advisor in many cases. But General Sofrin, when we're looking at the region, we do see that the isolationist bloc in the Trump administration has failed. The person right now who has managed to draw in much of the leverage within the Trump administration is no other than National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is known for his adamant support for the State of Israel. He's gaining much more traction also within the conservative movements and is even labeled as a potential candidate for presidency post-Trump era, which is a significant shift from the J.D. Vance discussion and discourse that was taking place prior to the current administration. In that, how do you see the current strategic landscape in the Middle East? Is that something that is being taken into consideration?
I think that if we look at the Middle East, the Americans are trying to get to agreements that are being imposed on the countries. Not necessarily by full agreement and full cooperation, but dictating in a way. If you look at the agreement that they try to broker right now in Gaza Street, for example, this is being forced on Israel. Not willingly. Israel will not settle with that an ISF will be established in Gaza. I don't believe it's going to happen, by the way. I think it's very problematic and nobody is really willing to contribute its soldiers to begin fighting with Hamas and to try to disarm it. It won't happen. They will, at the most, will sit there and say that we're buffering between the Israelis and the Hamas. That's it. That will be the role. Not more than that. So no big expectations. But nevertheless, Americans are now saying openly, we're going to stage B. And we're advancing, not necessarily waiting for the late Ron Gwilly to come back home or to be brought back home, but we're going to advance anyhow for the second phase. And you, the Israelis, will apply to what we say. That means we don't ask your permission. We're telling you that what we're aiming to do, and that is going to happen. The same goes with what we try to do with Ukraine. To try to impose on President Zelensky kind of an agreement that is a kind of a surrender. You will surrender to the demands of Mr. Putin. You will settle with that, the fact that I will protect you if and when needed, some vague promise, and no more than that. That means Israel has his own interests. Now, looking at the Middle East, I believe that first of all, he wants to settle the issue with Gaza and to advance because this is very important for him for the Nobel Prize. He doesn't really care what happens in Lebanon, even though he tries to apply pressure on the president and the prime minister to try to dismantle Hezbollah, but they won't be able to do that by their own force. And Iran is still dragging its feet, and there is some threat that if you are going to shoot, more residents are going to interfere. In what way? To what extent? What is the aim of this interference? This is only, speaking
The art of the deal.
From the above. Not really going deep down to the details. Okay? But now everybody has to take its threats and promises more seriously because of what happened in Venezuela. This is a precedent. And everybody look at this precedent and say it may
Is
happen.
it precedent?
I think so.
And what about Panama?
No. 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it was
Yeah, it was,
ultimately they captured the leader of
Noriega.
Noriega, and they brought him to justice. That was as simple as that.
The Panama Canal
It's not
was
unprecedented.
another
Of course,
context.
of course.
No, it's interesting.
Now, bear in mind just now that Mr. Trump is telling the Danish government, Greenland is very important for me. We're going to
It is.
cooperate, but it will be mine. Either I buy it or I take it by force. That means he is now playing what we call with tough cards. It
Which is
doesn't
also
really-
not unprecedented.
No.
I mean, Alaska, ultimately, the Russians sold it before America took it over.
Yeah, but I'm speaking about the President Trump and his,
There was no military
his own agenda right now. And I believe that everybody today is very, very terrified from this unexpected behavior. The fact that the Danish intelligence agency defined for the first time in history the US as a possible rival, it's a precedent.
It is.
It never happened before. They're allies.
That, of course, would be the death of NATO as an alliance.
It would have far-reaching implications, undoubtedly. Ambassador Ayalon, with everything that we're talking about, what can Israel play within those complexities in order to position itself in a way that would guarantee its national security interests are preserved?
Well, I think Israel has very much benefited from this approach, new policies of Trump, because here, when actually power dictates, Israel's military power can play and does play a major role. Because Trump, which we see, that not only he's transactional president, but he also believes in power, and the powerful will survive, can rely very much on Israel for either stabilizing, for stopping Iran, as we have had, for now we are also going to take the Houthis. Israel has played very interesting games, especially now with the Somaliland. Israel's recognition of Somaliland, and that comes in the wake of Israeli establishing military presence, even in a much augmented way in Somaliland, whether it's vis-a-vis the Houthis, Iranians, and many others.
Even though publicly they're not talking about the military base.
Of course not. Of course not. They will not do it publicly for obvious reasons. But I think that in that respect, Israel carries a lot of value now for Washington of Trump. Now, to all those who are concerned about Trump's Nobel Peace Prize, I want to allay these concerns because he doesn't need it anymore. He was promised the Israel Prize by
No less
Netanyahu.
lucrative.
So I think that's the way he goes, and I don't.
By the way, is that a plus? If the Saudis and others don't like the Israel prize,
Yes.
is it even a plus for Trump to be bestowed this fantastic award?
You know, he is a guy who can really do many things which are contradictory. He can be a good friend of Erdogan, a good friend of Netanyahu, without anything in between. And let alone that he got the FIFA, the prize of peace also. So
A prize is a prize.
yes, exactly. So I think Israel now is standing on a much better footing. And also the sense of deterrence now after Venezuela, after what's happening in Iran. So we see again here, if we go back to the old chaos theory, where a butterfly flutters in Japan can cause a hurricane in Europe. We see what little Hamas did back on the 7th of October. We see ramifications, but there is no end of it yet.
I would say, first of all, the NSSD should be read very carefully. There are a lot of fascinating aspects there about the priorities of the administration. And they talk about
Just for the sake of reviewers,
national security strategy document, which is every administration is actually obliged to provide under law. Since Nicholas Goldwater, it was supposed to be an annual thing. It became a quadri-annual thing, but it is a very interesting document, very ideologically driven against the fantasies and let's say fancy slogans of previous administrations. It's a very transactional text.
Absolutely.
And but focusing on Israel, where does Israel stand there? A lot of Israelis so taken aback by the very blunt statement that the U.S. doesn't care what regime governs foreign lands as long as it is friendly, of course. In other words, democracy is no longer a criteria. If the Saudis want to butcher journalists, that's not America's business. However, so Israel is no longer the sole, I mean, it is still the only democracy in the Middle East, but it's not an important point for this administration. However, it is in the short list of countries which Trump values as patriotic. It stands alongside a few European countries which are standing against the general rot of Europe that he describes. It is also technologically a partner in keeping America the military predominant force in world affairs. And the hint comes in an unexpected place. He wants to build a ballistic missile defense. He calls it Golden Dome. You cannot call it Golden Dome without obvious and clear reference to Iron Dome. That's a sense of saying Israel has led the way, and we can implement this on a much grander scale. There's no longer Star Wars. He tries to owe nothing to Reagan. That's very
There was
interesting.
Teapot Dome,
Teapot Dome, that
the
was
corruption
a very...
scandal of the 1920s.
I don't want to mention that. It's interesting that he expunged all the previous Republican, other than Lincoln. He compares himself to Lincoln. He doesn't mention Reagan. He never mentioned Teddy Roosevelt or any one of these famous leaders before him. The Bush 41 and 43 are as if they were never there.
Well, he does mention Reagan time and again.
Rarely. But he's very much focused on his own momentous contribution.
Reagan did
to
Grenada,
humanity.
same thing as Venezuela.
But but Israel. So Israel is important in other ways, and it is the only country mentioned by name where the U.S. is pledged to its security. So I would say that Israel is in an interesting position. In addition to Somaliland, I was just mentioned one more thing: the Israeli alignment. I'm careful not to call it an alliance, but alignment with Greece and Cyprus. Our position in the Eastern Mediterranean is a part against Turkey, but it's part of a strategic capacity to play as an independent strategic player in the region.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to hear a closing assessment. Where are we moving here until our next Powers in Play? What should our viewers and listeners think about, consider? Mr. Owen, we'll start with you.
I'd like to convert my assessment into a question to our senior and seasoned intelligence officers. Provided that Hamas knows where Police Master Sergeant Gwili is buried, provided that Israeli intelligence is wise enough to know what Hamas knows, doesn't it follow that Israel knows where Mr. Gwili is? Israel can conduct an operation to extract him, and that Israel decides not to do it in order not to go into the second stage in Gaza.
I don't believe that we know exactly where he's buried. Hamas probably knows, or maybe the Palestinian Islamic Jihad who was responsible for kidnapping him. Some of them know, not necessarily everyone, maybe a few people. We need to point out to Hamas who are the people that are responsible for burying him, so apply to them and apply pressure on them. That means that Israel, if Israel knew exactly where he was buried, I believe a special operation would be implemented in order to take him out.
I don't think Israel is actually interested in delaying stage 2 as long as stage 2 remains, let's say, within the framework of 2803 and Trump's position about Hamas disarmament. The moment that collapses, all our options are open.
I think at this point, everything is secondary to what's happening in Iran, including Gaza. If the Iranian regime falls, everything changes, and we have a really new Middle East. The Saudis will not be concerned too much about what's happening in Gaza, and we can really move forward to relationship and the Trump vision of normalization.
General, when we're talking about Iran, prospects for Iran falling, there are many speculations. We're not necessarily seeing a very intensive type of nationwide protest, but nonetheless, there are some implications there. What can you tell us really in half a sentence?
There are demonstrations in many places. It changed from economical reason to try to change the regime. They don't have enough power to do them by themselves, as long as they are not supported by the armed forces. And it needs somebody from the outside to try to change the regime.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Lerman, General Sofrin, Ambassador Ayalon, and Mr. Oren for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition. Shalom.